The silence of Marcus Whitley's cabin had grown so complete over the past 18 months that even the sound of his own breathing seemed like an intrusion on the perfect stillness he had cultivated around himself like armor. He sat at the oak table he had built with his own hands during the first year after Anna's death, staring down at the single plate and cup that comprised his entire evening meal. Beans and hardtack, the same combination he had eaten for the past 3 weeks, because thinking about food had become too much effort to sustain. The table could have seated 8 people comfortably, had been designed for the large family he and Anna had planned to raise in this remote corner of the Utah Territory. Now it stretched before him like a desert of polished wood, emphasizing with cruel precision just how alone he had become. The other chairs remained pushed neatly against the wall, where Anna had placed them during her final week, when she was still strong enough to organize their home, even as the consumption slowly drained the life from her lungs. Marcus chewed his beans with mechanical precision, tasting nothing, thinking nothing beyond the basic requirements of continued existence. Outside his windows, the October evening was settling over the valley with the kind of golden light that Anna had always loved. But he kept his eyes fixed on his plate to avoid seeing beauty that would only remind him of conversations they would never have, sunsets they would never share, dreams that had died with her in this very room. The sound, when it first reached his awareness, was so soft and unfamiliar that he thought it might be wind stirring the fallen leaves around his cabin. A gentle rustling, accompanied by something that might have been whispers or might have been the distant murmur of water over stones. Marcus paused in his eating, his fork halfway to his mouth, and listened with the alertness of a man who had lived alone long enough to become sensitive to every change in his environment. The whispers grew clearer, resolving into what sounded like children's voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize. But that was impossible. The nearest settlement was 40 miles through mountain passes that would be treacherous for adults, let alone children. Marcus lived in deliberate isolation, had chosen this valley precisely because it was so remote that no one would be likely to stumble across his grief and try to heal it with good intentions and unwanted sympathy. He set down his fork and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain that Anna had sewn from blue gingham during their first spring together. What he saw made him question whether the solitude had finally driven him to hallucination, whether months of speaking to no one but ghosts had caused his mind to create companions from shadow and wishful thinking. Children surrounded his cabin, perhaps a dozen of them ranging in age from what looked like 5 or 6 up to adolescents on the verge of adulthood. They were clearly Native American, though he couldn't immediately identify which tribe, dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and items that had obviously been traded from white settlements. What struck him most was their behavior. They weren't hiding or approaching with caution, but moving around his property with the casual confidence of visitors who had been expected. The oldest of the group, a girl of perhaps 14 with long black braids and intelligent dark eyes, noticed him at the window and raised her hand in greeting. She spoke to the others in their native language, and several of the smaller children waved enthusiastically, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that suggested adventure rather than fear. Marcus stepped back from the window, his heart hammering with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been panic. He had no idea how to handle this situation, had spent so long avoiding human contact that the prospect of conversation felt almost physically painful. These children clearly needed something: food, shelter, directions. But he had forgotten how to be helpful to other people, had lost the ability to think beyond his own carefully circumscribed world of grief and routine. A gentle knock at his door interrupted his racing thoughts. 3 soft raps, polite and patient, followed by a young voice speaking careful English with an accent that made each word sound like music. "Mr. Marcus," the voice called. "We come to visit. Grandmother sent us to bring gifts." Marcus approached his door on unsteady legs, his hand hovering over the wooden latch as he tried to process what he was hearing. Someone's grandmother had sent children to visit him. How was that possible? He had spoken to no one in the territory except traders who came by perhaps twice a year, and those conversations had been limited to the basic business of purchasing supplies. "I think you have the wrong cabin," he called through the closed door, his voice rusty with disuse. "Nobody here expects visitors." "No wrong cabin," the young voice replied with quiet certainty. "You are Marcus, who lost his wife Anna to the sickness. You are Marcus, who sits alone and forgets to eat good food. Grandmothers say you need visitors whether you expect them or not." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. How could these children know about Anna, know her name? He hadn't spoken her name aloud to another human being since the trader who had helped him bury her had ridden away 18 months ago. The precision of their knowledge was both unsettling and somehow comforting, suggesting that his isolation hadn't been as complete as he had believed. Marcus opened the door slowly, revealing the girl who had been speaking. The same teenager he had seen from the window, but now close enough for him to see the compassion in her dark eyes, the patient kindness that seemed far too mature for someone her age. Behind her, the other children had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, all watching him with expressions of curious sympathy. "I am called Dancing Star," the girl said, offering a small bow that managed to be both respectful and welcoming. "These are my cousins and brothers and sisters. We are Ute people, from the band that camps in the valley beyond the Red Rocks. Our grandmother, she is called Wise Woman, and she has the sight that sees beyond what eyes can show." The girl gestured toward a collection of bundles and baskets that the children had apparently brought with them. "Grandmother had dreams about white man who lives alone in valley, where wildflowers remember happier times. She saw man who stopped living when his woman died, who forgot that grief shared is lighter than grief carried alone. She sent us to remind you that children bring light to dark places, that sharing food makes it taste better than eating alone." Marcus found himself staring at the collection of items the children had brought. Baskets that smelled of fresh bread, bundles that might contain vegetables or preserved meat, small packages wrapped in colorful cloth. It was clearly enough food for a feast, more than he typically ate in a week, prepared with the kind of care that spoke of grandmotherly love and concern. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "How does your grandmother know about me? About Anna?" Dancing Star's expression softened with something that looked like gentle pity. "Wise women say white people think they live separate from all other life, think they can carry pain alone without it touching the world around them. But her dreams show her that your sadness has been calling out for many moons, that even the birds and deer know about the man who stopped singing with the sunrise." One of the smaller children, a boy of perhaps 6 with round cheeks and bright eyes, tugged on Dancing Star's sleeve and whispered something in Ute. She listened carefully, then turned back to Marcus with a smile that transformed her serious face. "Little Fox say to tell you that he helped grandmother make special bread for you, bread with honey and nuts that is good for men who forget to take care of themselves. He wants to know if you will share it with us, because sharing makes the bread taste even sweeter." Marcus looked down at the boy, who was watching him with the kind of hopeful expectation that children wore when they had worked hard on something they wanted to give as a gift. The child's enthusiasm was infectious, cutting through the careful barriers Marcus had built around his heart, with the efficiency of sunlight through clouds. Marcus began, then stopped, realizing he had no idea what he wanted to say. Part of him wanted to retreat back into his cabin, to send these children away before their presence could disturb the carefully maintained numbness that had been his only protection against unbearable loss. But another part of him, a part he thought had died with Anna, stirred with something that felt almost like hunger, not for food, but for the warmth that radiated from these young visitors, like heat from a campfire. "I don't have enough chairs," he said finally. the words escaping before he could stop them. Dancing Star's smile widened, and she spoke rapidly to the other children in Ute. Immediately they sprang into action with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested they had anticipated this problem. Some began gathering fallen logs from around his woodpile. Others produced blankets from their bundles, and within minutes they had created a comfortable seating arrangement around his porch that looked more inviting than his solitary table had in months. "Ute children, we know how to make feast anywhere," Dancing Star explained as she directed the younger ones in arranging their makeshift dining area. "Grandmother say the best meals happen outside anyway, where sky can see the food and bless it with starlight." What followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced since Anna's death. The children unpacked their bundles with the ceremony of people preparing for celebration rather than simple sustenance. There was indeed fresh bread, still warm and fragrant with honey and nuts, but also roasted rabbit seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, vegetables that had been prepared in ways that brought out flavors he had forgotten existed, and fruits dried into concentrated sweetness that burst on his tongue like captured sunshine. But more than the food itself, it was the way it was shared that began to crack the ice around Marcus's heart. The children insisted that he try everything, passing dishes with the enthusiasm of people sharing treasures rather than simple sustenance. They told him stories about how each dish was prepared, about the ceremonies and traditions that surrounded the gathering and preparation of food, about the way their grandmother had instructed them in the proper presentation of gifts to someone who had forgotten how to receive them. Little Fox, the boy who had helped make the bread, appointed himself as Marcus's personal server, ensuring that his plate never remained empty for more than a few seconds. The child's dedication to his task was so earnest that Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in months, touched by the simple generosity of someone who wanted nothing more than to see him well fed and happy. "Why bread with honey?" Marcus asked, as Little Fox offered him a third piece of the sweet, nutty loaf. "Grandmother say honey is tears of happiness that bees make from flowers," Little Fox replied solemnly. "She say man who has cried too many sad tears needs to taste happy tears for balance." The simple wisdom of the child's words cut deeper than any sermon Marcus had ever heard. He had indeed cried an ocean of sad tears, had worn grief like a hair shirt that he thought he deserved to carry for the rest of his days. The idea that happiness might be not just possible, but necessary for some kind of spiritual balance had never occurred to him. As the meal progressed and the sun set behind the mountains that ringed his valley, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations that ranged from practical to profound. The older children asked questions about his life before Anna's death, about the work he had done and the places he had seen. Their curiosity was genuine and non-intrusive, creating space for him to remember parts of himself that grief had buried beneath layers of self-imposed silence. In return, he learned about their lives in ways that expanded his understanding of the territory around him. The Ute band that Dancing Star belonged to followed traditional seasonal patterns, moving between different camps as weather and resources dictated. They knew this valley well, had been watching over him from a distance without his knowledge, understanding that white men often preferred isolation to the kind of community support that native cultures considered essential for survival. "Grandmother say you build good cabin in place where her grandmother used to gather medicine plants," Dancing Star explained, as the evening stars began to appear overhead. "She say spirits of this place like you, like how you treat the land with respect, how you take only what you need and leave everything else to grow wild and free." This revelation surprised Marcus, who had never considered that his valley might hold significance for the original inhabitants of the territory. He had chosen it for its remoteness and beauty, but the idea that others had found it sacred added layers of meaning to his presence there that he had never contemplated. "Does that mean I shouldn't be here?" he asked, suddenly concerned that his grief-driven retreat might be a form of trespass. "No," Dancing Star replied firmly. Grandmother say good men are welcome in sacred places, especially men who know how to suffer without becoming bitter, who know how to live quietly without disturbing the balance of natural things. She say your sadness has been like rain that feeds the plants Anna loved, heavy sometimes, but necessary for growth. The conversation was interrupted by one of the younger children, a girl of perhaps 8, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal. She approached Marcus shyly, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin, and spoke to Dancing Star in rapid Ute before offering her bundle to the white man with obvious nervousness. "Singing Bird made this for you," Dancing Star translated. She say, when her grandfather died last winter, making things with her hands helped the sadness find a way out of her heart. She thinks maybe you need something to make with your hands too. Marcus unwrapped the deerskin carefully, revealing a collection of beadwork supplies, tiny glass beads in every color imaginable, sinew for threading, needles carved from bone, and a partially completed medallion that showed a pattern of flowers that looked remarkably like the wildflowers that bloomed around his cabin each spring. "She started the pattern," Dancing Star explained, "but she wants you to finish it. She say men can do beadwork too, and that working with small, beautiful things helps big, sad things become smaller and more manageable." Marcus looked down at the delicate work in his hands, then up at Singing Bird's hopeful face. He had never done anything like beadwork, had always considered such crafts to be women's work, but something about the child's earnest gift touched him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "I don't know how," he said softly. "We teach you," Singing Bird replied in careful English, her voice barely above a whisper. Not hard, just gentle, like painting with tiny pieces of sky. What followed was his first lesson in a skill he had never imagined he might possess. The children gathered around him as Singing Bird and Dancing Star demonstrated the basic techniques of bead weaving, their small fingers moving with the kind of practiced grace that spoke of skills learned from earliest childhood. Marcus's first attempts were clumsy and uneven, but the children offered encouragement rather than criticism, treating his mistakes as natural parts of the learning process. As his fingers slowly learned the rhythm of the work, Marcus found himself entering a meditative state he hadn't experienced since Anna's death. The tiny beads required complete concentration, leaving no mental space for the endless cycle of grief and regret that usually occupied his thoughts. Colors and patterns began to emerge under his inexperienced hands, creating something beautiful from individual elements that meant nothing in isolation. "You see," Singing Bird said as Marcus completed his first small section of the pattern, "sadness still there, but now it has place to go. Now it becomes part of something beautiful instead of just sitting heavy in heart." The wisdom of the child's observation struck Marcus with unexpected force. He had been carrying his grief like a burden that had no purpose beyond its own weight, had never considered that mourning might be transformed into something creative rather than simply endured. The beadwork gave his hands something to do, and his mind something to focus on beyond the endless repetition of loss and loneliness. As the evening progressed, other children shared their own gifts and skills. A boy named Fast Horse demonstrated how to braid grass into useful cordage, while his sister Bright Moon showed Marcus how to weave pine needles into baskets that could hold water. Each skill came with stories about its traditional uses, about the ancestors who had developed these techniques, and the ceremonies that surrounded their practice. But perhaps most importantly, the children shared their laughter. It bubbled up spontaneously as they worked and talked, infectious and healing in ways that Marcus had forgotten were possible. When Little Fox accidentally dropped a handful of beads and they scattered across the porch like tiny jewels, the boy's dramatic expression of dismay sent the other children into fits of giggles that soon had Marcus chuckling despite himself. "Anna would have loved this," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in company since her death, and the sound of it, hanging in the evening air, felt both painful and liberating. "Tell us about Anna," Dancing Star said gently. "Grandmother say speaking names of those we love keeps them close to the world of the living, helps their spirits know they are still remembered with happiness instead of just sadness." So Marcus found himself talking about his wife for the first time since her death, describing her laugh and her terrible cooking, her love of wildflowers and her fierce determination to make their remote cabin into a real home. The children listened with the kind of attention that transformed storytelling into ceremony, asking questions that helped him remember details he thought grief had stolen from him. "She sounds like woman who would like to see you laughing again," Dancing Star observed, when Marcus finished describing Anna's attempts to garden in the rocky soil around their cabin. "Grandmothers say, when people love each other truly, they want their beloved to find joy again after they are gone. They want to be remembered with smiles instead of just tears." As the night deepened and the children began to show signs of tiredness, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The terrible weight of isolation that had pressed down on him for 18 months had lifted, replaced by something lighter but no less significant. He was still a man who had lost the love of his life, but he was no longer a man who had to carry that loss alone. "Where will you sleep?" he asked, suddenly concerned about the practical needs of his unexpected guests. "Under stars," Dancing Star replied, matter-of-factly. "We have blankets and know how to be warm outdoors. Besides, grandmother say first visit should not be too long, should not overwhelm man who has forgotten how to be around people. We will stay tonight and leave tomorrow, but we will come back when seasons change, when you have had time to practice being less alone." The children settled themselves around a small fire they built in Marcus's yard, creating a temporary camp that felt both exotic and strangely comforting. As he watched them prepare for sleep with the efficiency of people accustomed to adapting to different surroundings, Marcus realized that his cabin would feel unbearably empty when they departed. "Will you really come back?" he asked Dancing Star as she arranged her blankets near the fire. "Grandmother say you will need visitors until you remember how to be visitor yourself," she replied. "Until you learn to go out into world again, instead of waiting for world to come to you. But yes, we will come back. Children need to learn from elders who have wisdom earned through suffering, and elders need to remember what it feels like to see world through young eyes." That night, Marcus slept more soundly than he had since Anna's death, lulled by the soft sounds of children breathing around his cabin and the knowledge that he was no longer the only living thing in his valley. When he woke the next morning, the children were already stirring, preparing a breakfast that filled his cabin with smells of hope and possibility. The departure, when it came, was both easier and harder than Marcus had expected. The children packed their belongings with the same efficiency they had shown in everything else, but they also left behind gifts beyond the beadwork supplies, dried herbs that would improve his cooking, a small drum that one of the boys insisted would help him remember how to make music, and detailed instructions for maintaining contact with their band when he felt ready for larger gatherings. Most importantly, they left him with a different relationship to his solitude. The silence of his cabin, when it returned, no longer felt like a tomb, but like a space pregnant with possibility. The table where he ate his meals was still too large for one person, but now he could imagine it filled with voices and laughter, could envision himself preparing food for others rather than simply consuming sustenance for survival. Over the months that followed, the children returned as Dancing Star had promised, bringing news of the changing seasons and the natural world beyond Marcus's valley. Each visit brought new skills and stories, gradually weaving him back into the fabric of community life in ways that felt natural rather than forced. He learned to speak basic Ute, discovered traditional foods that grew wild around his cabin, and slowly began to venture beyond his self-imposed boundaries. More importantly, he learned to honor Anna's memory through living rather than simply surviving. The beadwork that Singing Bird had taught him became a form of meditation and creativity, producing items of beauty that he could share with others rather than hoard in isolation. The laughter that the children brought to his valley became a permanent resident rather than a rare visitor, echoing in spaces that had known only sorrow for too long. When Marcus finally made his first journey to the Ute camp the following spring, he was welcomed not as a stranger but as family, included in ceremonies and celebrations that marked the cycles of life and renewal. The man who had sat alone at his table, convinced that his story had ended with Anna's death, discovered that some endings were actually beginnings in disguise, that community could be found in the most unexpected places, and that children carried medicine stronger than any herb that grew in mountain meadows.